Most people think fat loss is about the scale going down, but the most dangerous fat in your body doesn't show up clearly in the mirror. It's the fat packed deep inside your abdomen, wrapped around your organs, quietly interfering with hormones, blood sugar, and inflammation. For years, it builds without obvious symptoms. And then one day, you decide to change your diet, maybe reduce sugar, maybe start fasting, maybe simply stop snacking all day, and something remarkable begins to happen beneath the surface. Visceral fat doesn't behave like normal fat. It's metabolically active, hormonally disruptive, and highly sensitive to insulin. As long as insulin stays high, this fat stays locked in place, even if you're exercising or eating less. But when insulin finally drops, when the body shifts from constant feeding to actual fat burning, visceral fat is often the first to respond. Not because you're forcing it to burn, but because the hormonal environment has changed. This is where many people get confused. They feel the same, look the same, and think nothing is working. But internally, the body is making a strategic decision. The fat that's most harmful, the fat that raises the risk of diabetes, heart disease, fatty liver, and chronic inflammation, is being broken down and released into circulation to be used as fuel. The liver starts unloading stored fat. Inflammatory signals begin to quiet down. Insulin sensitivity slowly improves. You may notice subtle signs before you ever see visible changes. Less pressure in the abdomen, better blood sugar readings, reduced cravings, more stable energy between meals. These aren't coincidences. They're signals that your metabolism is switching modes from storage to utilization. This process isn't driven by willpower or calorie math. It's driven by hormones. When you stop constantly telling your body to store energy, it finally gets permission to access what has been hoarding for years. Visceral fat doesn't disappear overnight, but once the breakdown begins, it sets off a cascade of improvements that affect nearly every system in the body. Most people think fat is just stored energy, something passive that sits there waiting to be burned when you eat less or exercise more. But visceral fat is very different. This fat lives deep inside the abdomen, packed tightly around vital organs like the liver, pancreas, and intestines. And it behaves more like an active organ than a storage depot. It produces hormones, inflammatory chemicals, and signaling molecules that directly interfere with how your body regulates blood sugar, appetite, and energy use. This is why two people with the same body weight or the same body mass index can have completely different health outcomes. Because where fat is stored matters far more than how much there is. Visceral fat releases inflammatory cytokines that constantly signal stress to the body. This low-grade chronic inflammation doesn't cause sharp pain or obvious symptoms, but quietly damages blood vessels, disrupts insulin signaling, and increases the risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and fatty liver disease. Unlike subcutaneous fat, which mostly sits under the skin and acts as a relatively safe storage buffer, visceral fat drains directly into the portal vein, sending fatty acids and inflammatory signals straight to the liver. Over time, this overload pushes the liver toward insulin resistance, increased glucose production, and excess triglyceride formation. This is why visceral fat is so tightly linked to metabolic disease. Even in people who don't look overweight, someone can appear slim yet carry a dangerous amount of visceral fat, sometimes referred to as being metabolically obese, but normal weight. The mirror doesn't reveal this risk, but blood sugar levels, triglycerides, waist circumference, and liver enzymes often do. Visceral fat actively worsens these markers because it is constantly communicating with the rest of the body in a harmful way. Another key difference is how visceral fat responds to hormones, especially insulin. Visceral fat cells are highly sensitive to insulin storage signal. When insulin levels are chronically elevated due to frequent eating, high sugar intake, or refined carbohydrates, visceral fat becomes aggressively protected. The body treats it as priority storage, even when energy intake drops slightly. This explains why many people can diet for months, lose some weight, and yet see minimal improvement in metabolic health, because the most harmful fat remains largely untouched. Visceral fat also alters appetite regulation. The inflammatory signals it releases interfere with leptin and insulin signaling in the brain, making it harder to feel satisfied after meals. This creates a vicious cycle where the presence of visceral fat promotes overeating and frequent hunger, which in turn raises insulin and protects the visceral fat even more. It's not a failure of discipline, but a hormonal feedback loop driven by the fat itself. This hormonally active nature is what makes visceral fat so dangerous, but also so important to target correctly. Simply reducing calories without changing the hormonal environment often leads a body to conserve visceral fat while breaking down muscle or burning subcutaneous fat instead. The body prioritizes survival, and in a high insulin state, visceral fat is treated as a central energy reserve. This is why strategies that focus only on eating less can backfire, slowing metabolism and increasing fatigue without addressing the root problem. When visceral fat accumulates, it also affects cortisol regulation. Elevated stress hormones encourage more fat deposition in the abdominal region, particularly around the organs. This creates a strong link between chronic stress, poor sleep, and visceral fat gain. Over time, the body becomes stuck in a state where fat storage and hormonal disruption reinforce each other, even if calorie intake doesn't seem excessive. Understanding visceral fat as hormonally active changes how we think about fat loss and health. The goal isn't just to shrink fat cells, but to change the signals those cells are sending and receiving. When the hormonal environment shifts, visceral fat can no longer maintain its dominant disruptive role. Its inflammatory output decreases. Liver function begins to normalize. Insulin sensitivity improves, and the body gradually moves away from constant storage mode. This is why improvements in metabolic health often precede visible weight loss. Blood sugar stabilizes, triglycerides fall, and energy levels improve before the scale moves. The most dangerous fat is being dealt with first, even if it's happening silently and invisibly. The breakdown of visceral fat represents a fundamental shift in how the body manages energy risk and long-term health. And once that process begins, the internal environment starts to change in ways that make further progress possible without constant struggle or deprivation, because the body is no longer fighting to protect the very fat that was driving the problem in the first place. And the metabolic system begins to operate under a different set of signals, where storage is no longer the default response to every meal and every rise in insulin, allowing the body to finally recognize that the excess energy locked deep inside the abdomen is no longer needed for survival and can now be released and used as fuel, while the hormonal noise that once dominated the system slowly fades in the background as the balance shifts toward restoration rather than accumulation. Insulin is often misunderstood as simply a blood sugar hormone, but its primary role in the body is to regulate energy storage. Every time you eat, especially carbohydrates and sugar, insulin rises to move glucose out of the bloodstream and into cells. At the same time, it sends a powerful message to store energy and stop releasing fat. This signal is not subtle. When insulin is elevated, fat burning is effectively shut down. And this is especially true for visceral fat, which is highly responsive to insulin storage command. In a natural metabolic state, insulin rises after meals and falls between them, allowing the body to switch back and forth between storing energy and burning it. Problems begin when insulin never gets a chance to come down. Frequent snacking, refined carbohydrates, sugary drinks, and ultra-processed foods keep insulin elevated from morning until night. Even if calorie intake doesn't seem excessive, the constant insulin signal tells the body that energy is always coming in. So, there is no need to access stored fat. Visceral fat cells are particularly sensitive to this environment. They have more insulin receptors than subcutaneous fat cells, which means they respond aggressively to insulin's instructions. When insulin stays high, these fat cells become locked, resisting breakdown and release. This is why people can feel stuck, eating less, exercising more, and still seeing their waistline barely change. The hormonal signal to store is overpowering the conscious effort to lose fat. Chronically high insulin also drives insulin resistance. As cells are constantly exposed to insulin, they begin to respond less effectively. The pancreas compensates by producing even more insulin to keep blood sugar under control. This creates a cycle where insulin levels climb higher and higher just to maintain normal glucose levels. Visceral fat thrives in this environment because the elevated insulin continues to protect it, while the resistance ensures that insulin rarely drops low enough to allow fat burning. This state has widespread consequences beyond fat storage. High insulin promotes inflammation, increases sodium retention, raises blood pressure, and stimulates fat production in the liver. It shifts the body toward constant energy storage while depriving cells of metabolic flexibility. Instead of switching smoothly between glucose and fat for fuel, the body becomes dependent on frequent glucose intake, leading to energy crashes, cravings, and irritability when meals are delayed. One of the most damaging myths is that insulin only matters for people with diabetes. Long before blood sugar rises into the diabetic range, insulin can be chronically elevated. This condition, often called hyperinsulinemia, can exist for years or even decades without obvious symptoms. During this time, visceral fat accumulates quietly, metabolic health deteriorates, and the risk of chronic disease steadily increases, all while standard blood tests may still appear normal. Lowering insulin is not about eliminating food or forcing starvation. It's about giving the body periods of time when insulin can fall naturally. When insulin drops, the metabolic switch flips. Fat cells are allowed to release stored energy. The liver reduces glucose production. Inflammation begins to ease. This is the state in which visceral fat finally becomes accessible, not because it is being targeted directly, but because the hormonal environment no longer protects it. This explains why approaches that reduce insulin are often more effective than those that simply reduce calories. When insulin remains high, the body compensates for calorie restriction by lowering metabolic rate and increasing hunger. When insulin is allowed to fall, the body can draw on stored energy without triggering the same stress response. Hunger becomes more manageable, energy more stable, and fat loss more sustainable. Chronically high insulin is not a personal failure or a lack of discipline. It is a predictable outcome of modern eating patterns that encourage constant consumption and highly insulin-stimulating foods. Understanding this shifts the focus away from blame and toward physiology. When the insulin signal is constant, visceral fat remains locked in place. When that signal is reduced, the lock begins to loosen, and the body gradually reclaims the ability to access its own stored energy, restoring a more natural balance between feeding and fasting, storage and release, accumulation and utilization. The idea that eating fewer calories automatically leads to fat loss seems logical, but the body does not operate like a simple math equation. Calorie restriction assumes that all calories are treated the same, and that the body will willingly burn stored fat whenever intake drops. In reality, the body responds not just to the amount of energy coming in, but to the hormonal signals that accompany that energy. When calorie restriction is applied without changing those signals, especially insulin, the results are often disappointing and unsustainable. When calories are reduced, but insulin remains high, the body interprets the situation as a threat. Energy intake has dropped, yet the hormonal environment still signals storage. This creates a metabolic conflict. The body resolves this by conserving energy rather than burning fat. Metabolic rate slows, body temperature may drop slightly, and fatigue increases. Instead of accessing visceral fat, the body reduces energy expenditure and increases hunger, pushing you to eat more while holding on to stored fat. Visceral fat is especially resistant in this scenario because it is highly sensitive to insulin. It remains protected as long as insulin is elevated regardless of calorie. Fat, the body reduces energy expenditure and increases hunger, pushing you to eat more while holding on to stored fat. Visceral fat is especially resistant in this scenario because it is highly sensitive to insulin. It remains protected as long as insulin is elevated regardless of calorie intake. This explains why many people lose some weight at first on a calorie-restricted diet only to hit a plateau. The initial loss often comes from water, glycogen, and some subcutaneous fat, while visceral fat remains largely untouched. Metabolic health may improve slightly, but the deeper drivers of disease remain in place. Over time, prolonged calorie restriction can worsen insulin resistance. As metabolic rate slows, muscles become more efficient at using fewer calories, reducing glucose uptake. The pancreas responds by producing more insulin to manage blood sugar, further reinforcing the storage signal. This paradoxical response makes fat loss increasingly difficult the longer the diet continues, even as effort intensifies. Another unintended consequence is muscle loss. When insulin is high and fat is locked away, the body looks for alternative energy sources. Muscle tissue becomes a convenient option. Breaking down muscle reduces overall energy needs, allowing the body to survive on fewer calories. This loss of muscle further lowers metabolic rate and weakens long-term fat-burning capacity, making weight regain more likely once the diet ends. Calorie restriction also disrupts hunger hormones. Levels of ghrelin, the hormone that stimulates appetite, rise significantly during prolonged dieting. At the same time, leptin, which signals fullness and energy sufficiency, falls. These changes are not temporary. Studies show that these hormonal shifts can persist long after the diet ends, explaining why many people regain weight rapidly despite continued efforts to eat less. This pattern leads to a cycle of repeated dieting and regain. Each attempt begins with hope and discipline, followed by plateaus, fatigue, and intense hunger. Each failure is often blamed on willpower, but the underlying issue is physiological. The body is adapting exactly as it was designed to in response to perceived scarcity, prioritizing survival over fat loss. Visceral fat plays a central role in this cycle. Its inflammatory signals worsen insulin resistance and interfere with appetite regulation, making calorie restriction even more challenging. The presence of visceral fat increases the likelihood that calorie reduction will trigger metabolic slowdown rather than fat burning, especially when dietary choices continue to stimulate insulin. This is why focusing solely on calories misses the bigger picture. The body does not count calories. It responds to hormones. Without addressing insulin, calorie restriction becomes a battle against the body's protective mechanisms. True fat loss requires changing the signals that tell the body whether to store or release energy. When insulin is lowered, the same calorie intake can produce dramatically different results. The body becomes willing to access stored fat, including visceral fat, without shutting down metabolism. Hunger becomes more manageable, energy more stable, and muscle better preserved. The focus shifts from forcing the body to comply to allowing it to function as it was designed to, using stored energy when incoming energy is reduced. Calorie restriction alone often fails not because people lack discipline, but because it asks the body to do something it is hormonally programmed to resist without changing the internal environment. Less food simply leads to less energy, more hunger, and greater protection of the very fat that poses the greatest risk to health, reinforcing a cycle that feels personal but is fundamentally metabolic and predictable under the conditions of chronic insulin elevation. The body is constantly responding to signals, not intentions. And one of the strongest signals it listens to is insulin. When insulin is high, the message is clear. Store energy, stop burning fat, and prepare for more incoming fuel. When insulin falls, the message changes just as clearly. Incoming energy is limited. Stored energy must be used. This shift is not gradual or vague. It represents a metabolic switch that determines whether the body remains in storage mode or transitions into fat-burning mode. Lowering insulin does not force fat loss. It allows it. For long periods of modern eating, insulin rarely drops low enough to trigger the switch. Meals are frequent. Snacks fill the gaps, and many foods are specifically designed to raise insulin quickly and repeatedly. As a result, the body remains locked in storage mode even when calorie intake is reduced or exercise is increased. The metabolic system is flooded with a signal that says fat is not to be touched. When insulin levels fall, a cascade of changes begins almost immediately. Hormone-sensitive lipase, the enzyme responsible for breaking down stored fat, becomes active. Fat cells begin releasing fatty acids into the bloodstream, where they can be used by muscles, the liver, and other tissues for energy. At the same time, the liver reduces the production of glucose, lowering overall blood sugar demand, and further decreasing insulin secretion. This creates a reinforcing loop that favors fat burning rather than storage. Visceral fat is particularly affected by this shift because it is highly sensitive to insulin. It responds quickly when insulin drops. This is one reason metabolic improvements often occur before significant weight loss is visible. The body prioritizes reducing the fat that most disrupts hormonal balance and metabolic health. As visceral fat breaks down, inflammatory signals decrease, insulin sensitivity improves, and the overall metabolic environment becomes more favorable for continued fat loss. This process also restores metabolic flexibility, the ability to switch between burning glucose and burning fat depending on availability. In a high insulin state, the body becomes dependent on frequent glucose intake. leading to energy crashes and intense hunger between meals. When insulin is lower, the body can smoothly transition to using stored fat, providing a more stable and sustained energy supply. Hunger becomes less urgent, and the compulsion to snack weakens. Lower insulin changes how the brain perceives hunger and satiety. Signals from insulin and leptin become clearer, allowing the brain to accurately assess energy availability. Instead of responding with panic at slight reductions in food intake, the body recognizes that stored energy is available. This reduces the stress response associated with dieting and helps preserve metabolic rate. Muscle preservation is another critical effect of lowering insulin in the right context. When fat is accessible, the body has less need to break down muscle tissue for energy. This helps maintain strength, resting metabolic rate, and long-term fat-burning capacity. In contrast to calorie restriction alone, which often sacrifices muscle, a low insulin environment supports the use of fat as the primary fuel. Lower insulin also affects fat distribution. As visceral fat decreases, the body becomes less prone to storing new fat in the abdominal region. Cortisol levels stabilize, inflammation decreases, and hormonal signaling improves. This shifts fat storage patterns away from the organs and towards safer subcutaneous depots, reducing long-term health risk even before total fat mass changes dramatically. Importantly, lowering insulin does not mean eliminating carbohydrates or drastically reducing food. It means reducing the frequency and intensity of insulin spikes. Allowing insulin to fall between meals gives the body time to access stored energy. Over time, this repeated access retrains the metabolic system, making fat burning more efficient and less stressful. The switch from storage to burning is not about pushing harder or eating less. It is about changing the internal signals that govern energy use. When insulin drops, the body stops defending its fat stores and begins to treat them as the energy reserve they were meant to be. This hormonal permission is what makes fat loss possible without constant hunger or metabolic slowdown. And it explains why focusing on insulin rather than calories fundamentally changes the outcome of fat loss efforts, allowing the body to move out of chronic storage mode and into a state where stored energy can finally be used as intended. When fat loss finally begins, the body does not reduce all fat equally or randomly. It follows a priority system based on survival and metabolic efficiency. Visceral fat, the fat stored deep inside the abdomen around vital organs, is often broken down before subcutaneous fat because it poses a greater threat to normal metabolic function. This is not a cosmetic decision, but a physiological one. The body seeks balance, and visceral fat represents imbalance in its most disruptive form. Visceral fat releases fatty acids and inflammatory molecules directly into the portal vein, sending them straight to the liver. This constant exposure interferes with insulin signaling and forces the liver to produce more glucose and triglycerides. From the body's perspective, this is a liability. Once insulin levels drop and fat burning becomes possible, the body preferentially targets the fat that is most metabolically harmful. Removing visceral fat reduces inflammation and restores hormonal communication far more effectively than shrinking subcutaneous fat under the skin. This is why early fat loss often goes unnoticed externally. People may feel better, experience more stable energy, and see improvements in blood markers without a dramatic change in appearance. The mirror reflects subcutaneous fat, but it does not reveal what is happening around the organs. The scale may move slowly because visceral fat weighs less and occupies less visible volume compared to subcutaneous fat, even though its impact on health is profound. Another reason visceral fat is lost first is its sensitivity to hormonal change. Visceral fat cells respond quickly to reductions in insulin and improvements in insulin sensitivity. When insulin falls, these fat cells release stored energy more readily than subcutaneous fat cells, which are designed for longer-term storage. This responsiveness makes visceral fat a primary energy source once the body exits constant storage mode. Subcutaneous fat serves a different purpose. It acts as a buffer, protecting the body from excess energy overflow and providing insulation and mechanical cushioning. From an evolutionary standpoint, it is safer to retain subcutaneous fat than visceral fat. This is why the body is reluctant to give up visible fat early in the process. It is not resisting fat loss. It is prioritizing metabolic repair. This prioritization can be psychologically challenging. Many people expect to see their bellies shrink or their clothes fit differently as soon as they make changes. When that doesn't happen, they assume nothing is working. In reality, the most dangerous fat is being addressed first. The body is stabilizing blood sugar, reducing liver fat, and lowering inflammatory burden before focusing on appearance. Visceral fat loss also changes how future fat is stored. As inflammation decreases and insulin sensitivity improves, the body becomes less likely to deposit new fat in the abdominal cavity. This reduces a cycle of visceral fat accumulation and creates a metabolic environment where subcutaneous fat becomes a primary storage site, which is significantly less harmful. There is also a protective aspect to this sequence. Rapid loss of subcutaneous fat without addressing visceral fat can worsen metabolic health by increasing the circulation of fatty acids and inflammatory signals. By targeting visceral fat first, the body minimizes metabolic stress and reduces the risk of adverse effects during fat loss. This explains why people can experience major health improvements with modest weight loss. A small reduction in body weight that comes primarily from visceral fat can lead to significant drops in blood sugar, blood pressure, and triglycerides. These changes often occur long before dramatic physical transformations are visible. Understanding this order of fat loss reframes expectations. Progress should not be judged solely by the mirror or the scale. Internal changes are often the most meaningful and set the stage for sustainable visible fat loss later. Once visceral fat is reduced and metabolic health improves, the body becomes more willing to release subcutaneous fat without triggering hormonal resistance. The loss of visceral fat marks a turning point in metabolic health. It represents a shift away from chronic inflammation and insulin resistance toward balance and flexibility. Even though it may happen quietly and without immediate visual reward, it is a sign that the body is responding appropriately to improved signals and is beginning to resolve the deeper issues that drive fat accumulation in the first place, laying the groundwork for continued fat loss that is not forced, but allowed by a healthier hormonal environment. When meaningful fat loss begins, the most important changes often happen out of sight. The body prioritizes restoring internal balance long before it focuses on outward appearance. This is why many people experience improvements in how they feel, how their blood tests look, and how their metabolism functions before they see clear changes on the scale or in the mirror. These early internal shifts are not minor or temporary. They are signals that the body is repairing the underlying systems that control fat storage and energy use. One of the first areas to improve is blood sugar regulation. As visceral fat begins to break down, the liver receives fewer fatty acids and inflammatory signals. This allows it to respond more appropriately to insulin, reducing unnecessary glucose production. Blood sugar becomes more stable throughout the day with fewer spikes after meals and fewer crashes between them. Many people notice this as improved focus, steadier energy, and reduced irritability, even if their weight remains unchanged. Insulin sensitivity also improves internally before visible fat loss occurs. Muscles become better at taking up glucose, and the pancreas does not need to produce as much insulin to maintain normal blood sugar levels. Lower circulating insulin reduces the constant pressure to store fat, creating a metabolic environment that favors energy use over accumulation. This shift is measurable in lab values long before it becomes obvious in body composition. Another early change is reduced inflammation. Visceral fat is a major source of inflammatory cytokines, and as it decreases, the overall inflammatory burden on the body begins to fall. This can lead to improvements in joint comfort, digestion, and even skin health. Inflammation affects nearly every system, so reducing it can produce a wide range of subtle but meaningful improvements that are often dismissed or overlooked because they are not directly tied to weight. Hormonal signaling becomes clearer as internal fat decreases. Leptin, the hormone that communicates energy sufficiency to the brain, begins to function more effectively. Hunger signals become more predictable and less urgent. Cravings driven by blood sugar swings and hormonal disruption gradually weaken. This makes consistency easier, not through discipline, but through reduced internal resistance. Liver health often improves early in the process. Excess visceral fat is closely linked to fatty liver, a condition that interferes with normal metabolic regulation. As liver fat decreases, the liver becomes more efficient at processing nutrients, regulating cholesterol, and managing energy distribution. Improvements in liver enzymes are often seen before noticeable weight loss, reflecting genuine metabolic repair. Cardiovascular markers can also improve early. Reductions in triglycerides, improvements in HDL cholesterol, and lower blood pressure frequently occur with modest or even minimal changes in body weight. These changes reflect a reduction in visceral fat and inflammation rather than overall fat mass. From a health perspective, these internal improvements are far more important than rapid visible changes. This mismatch between internal progress and external appearance can be frustrating. The absence of immediate visual feedback leads many people to abandon effective strategies prematurely. The body is doing exactly what it should, but the signals people use to measure success are delayed. Understanding this timing prevents unnecessary changes that disrupt the healing process. The scale is particularly misleading during this phase. Changes in water balance, glycogen storage, and gut contents can mask fat loss for weeks. Muscle preservation or gain can also offset fat loss on the scale, even as body composition improves. Judging progress solely by weight obscures the deeper changes that determine long-term success. Early internal improvements also set the stage for visible fat loss later. As insulin sensitivity improves and inflammation decreases, the body becomes more willing to release subcutaneous fat without triggering metabolic slowdown or excessive hunger. What looks like a stall is often a period of metabolic recalibration. These early changes represent a shift from damage control to optimization. The body is moving away from constant stress and storage toward balance and flexibility. Although these improvements are quiet and easy to dismiss, they indicate that the most dangerous fat is being addressed and that the systems governing energy use are being repaired. Visible fat loss becomes easier and more sustainable once this internal foundation is established because the body is no longer fighting to maintain a state that was previously driven by hormonal disruption and chronic inflammation. When visceral fat begins to decrease, one of the most significant changes happens at the level of inflammation and insulin sensitivity. These two factors are deeply interconnected and play a central role in nearly every metabolic disorder. Visceral fat is not just stored energy. It actively produces inflammatory molecules that interfere with how cells respond to insulin. As long as this fat remains, inflammation stays elevated and insulin signaling remains impaired, creating a cycle that reinforces fat storage and metabolic dysfunction. Visceral fat releases cytokines such as tumor necrosis factor and interleukins that disrupt insulin receptors on cells. This makes it harder for glucose to enter muscles and other tissues, forcing the pancreas to produce more insulin to compensate. Higher insulin levels further protect visceral fat from breakdown, keeping the cycle intact. When visceral fat is reduced, this inflammatory output declines, allowing insulin receptors to regain sensitivity and respond more efficiently. Improved insulin sensitivity means the body can manage blood sugar with less insulin. This has immediate and far-reaching effects. Lower insulin levels reduce the constant signal to store fat, making it easier for the body to access existing energy reserves. Blood sugar becomes more stable, reducing spikes and crashes that drive hunger, fatigue, and cravings. This stability is often felt before it is seen as energy levels improve and mental clarity increases. Inflammation affects more than metabolism. It influences vascular function, immune response, and even brain chemistry. As visceral fat decreases and inflammatory signals subside, blood vessels become more responsive, improving circulation and lowering blood pressure. The immune system shifts away from a constant low-grade activation toward a more balanced state. This reduction in systemic inflammation can lead to improvements in joint comfort, digestion, and overall resilience to stress. The liver is one of the first organs to benefit from reduced visceral fat. Excess fat and inflammation impair the liver's ability to regulate glucose and lipids. As inflammatory signals decrease, the liver becomes more insulin sensitive and reduces unnecessary glucose production. Triglyceride levels fall and fatty liver begins to resolve. These changes reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes long before dramatic weight loss occurs. Muscle tissue also responds positively to improved insulin sensitivity. Muscles become better at taking up glucose and using it efficiently for energy. This supports physical performance and helps preserve lean mass during fat loss. Preserving muscle is critical for maintaining metabolic rate and long-term health. Yet, it is often overlooked in traditional weight loss approaches. The brain plays a central role in this process. Insulin and inflammatory signals affect appetite regulation and energy perception. Chronic inflammation and insulin resistance in the brain disrupts satiety signaling, making it difficult to feel satisfied after meals. As inflammation decreases, the brain becomes more responsive to leptin and insulin, improving appetite control and reducing the urge to overeat. This change is subtle but powerful, shifting behavior without relying on constant self-control. These improvements create a reinforcing cycle. Better insulin sensitivity leads to lower insulin levels, which makes fat burning easier. Reduced inflammation further improves insulin sensitivity, accelerating the process. Each improvement supports the next, gradually shifting the body out of a state of chronic metabolic stress. What makes this process particularly important is that it addresses the root causes of metabolic disease rather than just its symptoms. Weight loss alone does not guarantee improved insulin sensitivity or reduced inflammation. The specific loss of visceral fat does. This is why some people can lose weight and still remain metabolically unhealthy, while others experience dramatic health improvements with modest changes on the scale. The reduction of visceral fat changes how the body responds to food and stress. Meals provoke smaller insulin responses, and the body recovers more quickly afterward. Stress hormones have less impact on fat storage patterns. The system becomes more adaptable and less reactive. As insulin sensitivity improves and inflammation declines, the body's default state shifts. Energy is used more efficiently. Fat storage is less aggressive, and the internal environment becomes more supportive of long-term health. These changes often occur quietly and gradually, but they represent a fundamental transformation in how the body manages energy and risk, setting the stage for sustained improvements that extend far beyond visible fat loss. Sustainable reduction of visceral fat is not achieved through short bursts of effort or extreme interventions, but through restoring long-term hormonal balance. The body is designed to adapt, and when it senses constant stress, restriction, or deprivation, it responds defensively. True change happens when the internal environment signals safety, consistency, and metabolic flexibility. Visceral fat accumulates over years of hormonal disruption, and it resolves when those signals are corrected, not when the body is repeatedly pushed into emergency mode. Hormones govern every aspect of fat storage and release. Insulin, cortisol, leptin, ghrelin, and growth hormone interact continuously, shaping how the body uses energy. When these signals are chronically distorted, fat loss becomes a struggle regardless of effort. Sustainable visceral fat reduction requires aligning these hormones, so they work together rather than against each other. This alignment cannot be forced through willpower. It emerges through consistent patterns that the body can trust. One of the most important aspects of hormonal balance is predictability. Erratic eating patterns, frequent spikes in blood sugar, and constant grazing create hormonal chaos. Insulin remains elevated. Hunger signals become unreliable, and stress hormones rise. Over time, the body adapts by prioritizing fat storage, particularly in the visceral compartment. Restoring balance means creating rhythms that allow hormones to rise and fall naturally, giving the body time to switch between feeding and fasting states without panic. Sleep plays a critical role in this process. Poor sleep elevates cortisol and disrupts insulin sensitivity even in the absence of dietary excess. Chronically elevated cortisol encourages visceral fat storage and interferes with fat breakdown. Adequate consistent sleep lowers baseline stress hormones and supports growth hormone release, which aids fat utilization and tissue repair. Without addressing sleep, dietary changes alone often fall short. Stress management is equally important. Psychological stress triggers the same hormonal responses as physical stress, raising cortisol and promoting abdominal fat storage. Chronic stress signals danger, and the body responds by conserving energy. Sustainable fat loss requires reducing this background stress, so the body no longer feels compelled to protect its reserves. This does not mean eliminating stress entirely, but preventing it from becoming the dominant signal. Dietary composition matters not because of calories alone, but because of hormonal impact. Foods that provoke large insulin spikes repeatedly reinforce storage mode. Foods that support stable blood sugar allow insulin to fall between meals, restoring access to stored energy. Over time, this consistency retrains a metabolic system, reducing the defensive response that blocks visceral fat loss. Equally important is avoiding extremes. Severe restriction may lower insulin temporarily, but also raises cortisol and suppresses thyroid function. The body interprets this as a threat and adapts by slowing metabolism and increasing fat efficiency. Hormonal balance requires enough nutrition to signal safety, while avoiding constant stimulation that prevents fat burning. This balance is subtle but powerful. Sustainable change also depends on patience. Visceral fat reduction often begins internally and progresses gradually. Expecting rapid visible changes creates pressure that leads to inconsistent behavior and stress-driven decisions. When the focus shifts to consistency rather than speed, the hormonal environment stabilizes. The body begins to respond not because it is being forced, but because it no longer needs to resist. As hormonal balance improves, the body's response to food changes. Insulin responses become smaller and shorter. Hunger signals become clearer and less urgent. Energy levels stabilize. Throughout the day, these changes make long-term adherence possible without constant effort. What once required discipline becomes routine because the internal signals support the behavior. Over time, this balanced state becomes self-reinforcing. Reduced visceral fat improves insulin sensitivity, which further stabilizes hormones. Lower inflammation reduces stress signaling. Better sleep and energy support healthier choices. The system begins to regulate itself more effectively, reducing the likelihood of regain. Sustainable visceral fat reduction is not a phase or a temporary state. It reflects a return to a metabolic environment where storage and release are balanced appropriately. When hormones are aligned, the body no longer defends excess fat as if it were essential for survival. Instead, it treats stored energy as a resource to be used when needed, allowing visceral fat to diminish steadily as the internal signals shift away from accumulation and toward long-term stability and resilience.